Everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Rukmini Banerjee, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows for the year. Many economists have declared that global trade has reached its peak. We are in an era where globalization will rapidly fade, nations will slowly isolate, retreating from each other. However, some argue that this characterization is a gross over-exaggeration, with claims like this being made before and proven false time and time again. To clarify some of this discourse, as well as tell us his own theory, we have with us today Professor Daniel William Drezner. Professor Drezner is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He is also the co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia program. Prior to joining the Fletcher School of Law, Professor Drezner taught at the University of Chicago, at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has previously held positions with the Civic Education Project, the RAND Corporation, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. He has also received fellowships from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Harvard University. Professor Drezner has written and edited several books, including The Ideas Industry and All Politics is Global. He has published articles in numerous scholarly journals, as well as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, and Foreign Affairs, and has also been a regular contributor to the Foreign Policy and the Washington Post. Today, Professor Drezner will deliver the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies 2022 to 2023 Arthur Adams Family Distinguished Lecture on International Affairs. In his talk, Professor Drezner will tell us about his prediction for the future of globalization and why he believes our contemporary situation is different. We are witnessing economic closure never seen before, and the world order is shifting before our eyes. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. Please take this time to silence and put away your cell phones. We have an amazing lecture for you today. Be present and get ready to engage in dialogue and ask thoughtful questions. As usual, video and audio recording by the audience is strictly prohibited. Welcome to the Athenaeum.
Thank you all very much for coming. It is my challenge to make sure that none of you fall into a food coma as a result of eating, and I'm going to do my darndest to do that. It is also a pleasure to be among familiar faces. I've been longtime friends with Professor Apple. We actually went to college together, so I think I can honestly say I know you longer than anyone else in this room. And Professor Uvin is in the back, not dressed up to code, but still. He was technically my boss at the Fletcher School, although I want to put boss in quotes because in the university, being someone's boss means they ask you very politely to do stuff, and occasionally if you're a professor, you say yes, and occasionally you say yes and forget to do something, and then occasionally you just say no. But that said, let's get to the conversation that I'm supposed to deliver. So most of the people in this room, were scarily enough born in this century. And for all of you, globalization is a constant in your life. You were used to the idea that the sort of flow of goods, services, ideas, even occasionally people across borders was, if not effortless, at least relatively easy, especially compared to previous eras of world economic history. And when we talk about globalization, what we mean is the ability to cross borders and the ways in which, regardless of those kinds of barriers, it is easy to get information, get ideas, get goods, services, capital, you name it. Now, is globalization dying? And there are certainly lots of surface signs for this. If you want to talk about rhetoric, there is no denying that we live in a different world than we did even 10 years ago. Donald Trump, when he was elected president, ran on an explicit platform, and indeed, in the most cogent address he delivered, his inaugural address, he said, protection is good for the U.S. economy. He later famously tweeted that trade wars are good and easy to win. Neither of those statements are accurate. But nonetheless, that's what he said. And he then proceeded to follow through on his promise to launch tariffs on China, on the European Union, on pretty much the rest of the world. And we also see this in terms of policy. So one of the primary global governance structures that sort of maintained an open global economy was the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization operates, among other things, by an appellate body, which sort of offers, in some ways, functions as the Supreme Court for the WTO. The appellate body is no longer functioning, and the reason it's no longer functioning is that the Trump administration essentially vetoed any suggestions for replacements for the appellate board. And then once you serve on the appellate body, you can only serve for a certain period of time, and then afterwards, that's it. Now, it would be easy to just blame Trump for this, but it's worth noting that the first president to do this kind of veto power was actually Barack Obama, which suggests that there might be something deeper going on. That said, despite the sort of policy moves that we see, trade wars and, trying to sabotage the WTO, it's worth noting that, despite all that, if you look at sort of flows of trade, sort of basic level of globalization, both Sino-American trade and Sino-European trade hit record levels in 2021. And furthermore, those trade volumes were a 20% increase from 2020 and the highest level ever. Now, to be fair, that's kind of an artifact. What's actually happening here is that the pandemic was sort of subsiding, and so people actually started buying stuff again. But if you look at the DHL Global Connectedness Index, what it shows is that globalization was sort of, tapering off, but it seemed to be, going forward again. And so one of the things that we've had to reconcile is this constant rhetoric and claims that globalization is bad and we need to put a stop to it. And yet if you actually look at the aggregate data, it seems like in many ways the global economy is just as interconnected as it was before. And it's worth remembering that if you want to talk about globalization, the ease to move goods and services across borders, policy is certainly one factor of this, but it's hardly the only one, and it might not even be the most important one. If there's technological innovations that make it easier to send goods across, services across borders, it doesn't matter if you raise tariffs, you're still lowering the overall price of exchanging across borders. If capital markets become more sophisticated, well, then it's potentially easier to finance those kinds of trades. And if you're operating in a secure environment, then that also reduces risk and that also increases the likelihood of global economic exchange. So maybe what we're doing is experiencing one of these replays of past eras. So back in the 1890s, you actually began to see in Europe increasing amounts of trade wars. Countries taking severe action because they no longer like being so interdependent with each other. You saw trade wars between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, between Germany and Russia, between France and Italy. My favorite is between Austria-Hungary and Serbia because that is literally called the Pig War. It didn't matter. Trade still surged during this period, and the reason was the development of the steamship and the proliferation of railroad tracks made it so much cheaper to trade across borders that even if tariffs were going up, the cost of actually trading across borders went down. Or similarly, if you want to look at the 1970s, and what slide deck isn't improved by a disco shot? That was a period where Bretton Woods seemed to collapse. There were sort of nascent movements toward protectionism, whether you're talking about voluntary export restraints or trigger price mechanisms for steel or a whole variety of other things. And yet, in the end, the global economy eventually shook that off and just continued to accelerate and become ever more integrated. Maybe we are in one of those periods like the 70s where, globalization slowed down a little bit and then it'll pick back up again. And I've been upbeat before, all right? I wrote a book in 2014 called The System Worked, arguing that essentially the response to the 2008 financial crisis was better than you would have expected in terms of global, in terms of what you could have seen. I'm Jewish, and I always like to say the Jewish title for that book was, "It Could Have Been So Much Worse." And, that's the way to sort of think about the response to the 2008 financial crisis. Not great, but certainly better than you would have expected, especially compared to, let's say, the interwar period. And part of the reason I made that argument is that there were factors pushing for continued economic openness: the distribution of power, the distribution of interests, and the dominant set, the sort of hegemonic set of ideas that governed how the global economy functioned. So there might be reasons to be optimistic now, except the answer I have is that no. I'm much more pessimistic now. In large part because all those three factors, power, interest, and ideas, are actually now pushing the global economy towards closure to a degree that none of us have seen in our lifetimes. And what is interesting to me is that even those who criticize the sort of neoliberal version of globalization that you saw in the 1990s and 2000s are now beginning to grow a little bit worried about the direction that the global economy is going. And not to alarm you, but we have yet to game out just how dangerous this situation could be over the next decade or so, and I will explain why going forward. So it's worth asking, how bad is it? Because like, if you've been alive for the last 15 years, it's been a minute. We've seen some stuff. It's been hard. From the 2008 financial crisis onward, there has been shock after shock after shock, all right? Beginning with that financial crisis, which in its first year was the most severe economic recession in a century, and that includes the start of the Great Depression, to 2016, where Brexit is approved, Donald Trump is elected president, the sort of growth of populism. That also seems like a huge shock, and yet trade continued to surge. And then, of course, the pandemic, where we literally could not leave our houses, or we're not supposed to leave our houses for all that much. That is often considered a real damper on economic activity. And yet again, the global economy proved relatively resilient in the end. It recovered from that as well. And so it's worth being pessimistic about my pessimism. In other words, I'm saying this time is different, but you can point out, Professor Drezner, we've seen this over the last 15 years, body blow after body blow after body blow, and the global economy continues to thrive. But that said, we are now beginning to see trends moving in the opposite direction. So if you just want to talk about trade as a percentage of global output, sort of trade openness index, for the first time since the interwar era, we're now beginning to see deglobalization. All right, we're seeing economies becoming less integrated. Now I want to stress, if you can read that graph, it's still very highly integrated. We're declining from an extremely high starting point. But the question to ask is, does that trend continue to extrapolate, or will it reverse course? And unfortunately, what I think is that it's going to continue to extrapolate. So what happened? Why are we in the situation we are now? All right, first, in 2008, I argued that the reason the global economy stayed open was because the US was still undeniably the hegemonic power in the world. It was the most powerful actor out there. There were times where it was thought that, oh, China's rising, the US is declining, we're really bipolar. That was not the case in 2008. One of the things that people began to realize in the wake of the crisis was that the US still had significant amounts of structural power. In 2023, I don't think that's the case anymore. The US remains first among equals. It remains an extremely powerful actor. But if you look at the sort of key structural pillars of power, the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon. Now, one area where the US continues to be the hegemon is financial markets, capital markets. The dollar is still the reserve currency. US capital markets are far and away the deepest, most liquid, most sophisticated. People will tell you, oh, well, people are losing their interest in the dollar. There's going to be other alternatives. There'll be the renminbi. I'm very skeptical of this for a variety of reasons. And anyone who suggests crypto as an alternative, oh, don't do that. I'm just going to go to town on you. So if you want to talk about finance, the US is still undeniably the unquestioned hegemon. But if you want to talk about structural pillars of power in the global economy, you can't just talk about finance. You also have to talk about production and trade. And the US is no longer the most important actor when it comes to production and trade. China is, both in terms of manufacturing and in terms of global supply chains. The US might still be the largest market, but when it comes to how we produce things, China is still in some ways the most important central node. That might continue to be true. We'll see what happens going forward. But in terms also of other countries, the country that had, it used to be that in 2008, most countries in the world, their largest trading partner was the United States. If you look at it now, the country, that has the most amount of sort of trading partners is China. In other words, more countries, have China as their largest trading partner than the United States. And that leads to significant amounts of influence in some ways. A large economy is like gravity. It's a center of gravity. And so as a result, countries have less of an incentive to alienate China. Another key pillar is information, both the ability to provide reliable information and to generate new ideas and new information and new ways to innovate in the global economy. And here we're seeing some disturbing trends. It used to be that information about national economies was pretty open, pretty transparent. Over the last 5 years, both China and Russia, for in some cases obvious reasons, have become much more opaque in terms of the data they provide. And so as a result, it's not just that we don't, these economies are doing well or doing poorly. We don't know. We can't trust the data, and that's a problem. And then in terms of innovation, Russia, frankly, we don't need to worry all that much about. China, we do. Now, I'm somewhat more sanguine about this than many, but nonetheless, if you project things like papers about artificial intelligence or other sort of leading sectors, what becomes clear is that China has rapidly caught up to the United States and might overtake the United States over the next decade. So we're not talking about, let's say, a Cold War era where the only reason you cared about the Soviet Union was because it had nuclear weapons. You care about China because it has as much economic might as it does military might. And what's happening in the bipolar world is that we no longer live in a world where everyone just cares about absolute gains. We live in a world in which relative gains matters. It's not just how well am I doing, it's am I doing better than others? And we see this in the kind of policies that are being implemented and the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing. And so what's interesting to me is, Jens Stoltenberg, who's the Secretary General of NATO, talks about the war in Ukraine being a wake-up call, not just for dealing with Russia, but for dealing with China, which is a little weird for NATO because China's not in their neighborhood. And yet, in some ways, the war has been fascinating because it has really transformed, in some ways, European attitudes, not just about Russia, but about China. And therefore, concerns about relative gains. And when you have concerns about relative gains, you are going to see policies that try to decouple economies. And this leads to black and white thinking. And I want to be very clear here. I think there are completely valid reasons to be concerned about China's rise. China's not been a terribly well-behaved actor over the last 5 years. You've seen, repression in Xinjiang, repression in Hong Kong, a sort of greater autocracy in terms of Xi Jinping's continued staying in power, wolf warrior diplomacy, and so on and so forth. But the question we have to ask is what kind of relationship does the West want to have with China? And we're seeing increasingly sort of black and white thinking on this. And this is encapsulated most recently by the new sort of special committee, select committee on China that was convened just this month. And the first hearing was held either a week ago, it might have been in March or like last week in February, I'm not entirely sure. But what you were seeing was both Democrats and Republicans essentially outbidding each other, trying to sound more hostile to China. Okay, and these are the quotes from Mike Gallagher, who is the Republican and committee chairman. And I want to be very clear about this. I actually know Mike Gallagher. Mike Gallagher is a serious guy. He's not a buffoon. He's actually, by the standards of the Republican Party, pretty moderate. All right. He's also incredibly well informed about China. If he's making these statements, it's because the political incentives in Washington are now to sound tough on China. And there is no one making a contrary voice on this. So shifts in the distribution of power have led to an increase in relative gains. So that's one problem. But another problem is the shift in ideas. In 2008, you had the Washington Consensus, which is a whole set of controversies in and of itself, but generally a belief that the state should retreat from the market and let market forces determine allocation. In terms of macroeconomic policy, just pursue reasonably, stable, balanced budgets, fixed exchange rates. In terms of microeconomic policy, privatization and deregulation. And in terms of international policy, allowing for foreign direct investment, allowing for capital flows, freer trade. Even though the financial crisis was often attributed to the Washington Consensus, when it happened, no one had an alternative set of ideas. And so in the end, people wound up saying, okay, we just got to put Humpty Dumpty together again. By 2023, there is no consensus on the optimal set of policies because the last 15 years have essentially been these shock after shock after shock, causing people to doubt the virtues of things like free trade and free markets. And to be fair, there are valid reasons for this. So Karl Polanyi, who's an economic sociologist, wrote a book called The Great Transformation back in 1944. It was the second most famous economics book in 1944. Does anyone know what the first one was, by the way? Hayek's Road to Serfdom. These are two very different books. Hayek was making the case of free markets work great all the time. Polanyi was making the exact opposite argument. In fact, Polanyi warned that if you tried to pursue laissez-faire policies, it would inevitably lead to something called the double movement. So the idea of the double movement is simple. If you pursue laissez-faire policies, you are actually making the state take active roles to try to essentially segment itself from the market, to make a market the most autonomous actor in society. But if you do that, markets are volatile. There are booms, there are busts, there are crashes, there are vicissitudes in the market. This inevitably will cause societal disruption, which causes civil society to react badly. And when that happens, the state will intervene in ways to contravene laissez-faire and take some set of actions to protect citizens against the market. Now, that in and of itself is not an inherently bad thing, all right? You can do things like expand social safety nets or, improve healthcare. That's one way the form can take. The other way it can take, however, is populism, is essentially pursuing a more autarkic policy. In the United States, during the post-Cold War period, there was a fair amount of market volatility. All right. In particular, during the 1990s, which many people historically sort of think of, oh, that was a golden age for the US economy. There were actually two hidden shocks that wind up sort of kicking in over the last 20 years. The first was a tremendous influx of immigration into the United States, and the second was China's entry into the WTO. Now, this is often talked about in terms of the China shock, which does have differential effects. It doesn't, if you want to talk about it in terms of the economic language would be that China's entry into the WTO and entry into the global economy was still a Pareto improving move, but it's only a Pareto improving move if you actually make sure that the winners compensate for the losers. And in the United States, the winners did not compensate the losers. And so that led to increases in income inequality and wealth inequality. And the effect of immigration was to essentially sort of cause societies or cause localities that previously had thought of things in a certain way to realize, oh, suddenly the population of this town looks a little different than we saw it before. And as a result, there were people who, this is the sort of classic example of social conservatism, which is if you grow up in a town in one way and it starts looking in a different way, you're going to have a negative reaction to it. And this led to a surge of populism, epitomized by Donald Trump's election. Now, there's a lot of definitions of populism. Populism is like one of those words like neoliberalism and globalization. It could be anything you want it to be. And sometimes populist is a word that you just like to ascribe to views that you don't agree with, to sort of tar and feather it. The way I would define populism is what it opposes, which is pluralism. All right? A pluralist view of the world assumes that there are lots of different cross-cutting interests, lots of cross-cutting cleavages, and in the end, the way democracy works is by sort of accumulating those interests and sort of figuring out what policy, assures a majority. Populism does not assume that there are conflicts within society. It assumes there is a general will that you can derive from, and that if you endow a leader with enough power, that leader should simply execute common sense policies for the good of the people. Although admittedly, the people is often defined in a remarkably restrictive and sometimes racial way. Okay. What populism cannot stand are things like immigration. Populism is not a fan of globalization because the one thing that populism tends to assume is that there are elites somewhere screwing over the common man. And what populists cannot stand are technocratic elites executing policy, in their view, in ways that enrich them. In other words, the very people who work for the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank. Probably some of the people in this room, too. So as a result, populists tend to want to restrict immigration, implement trade protectionism, reject international agreements, because the other thing populists don't like is any constraint on their power. And treaties function as those constraints. And erect barriers of one kind or another, whether it's building a wall along the southern border, or tariffs, or other forms of restrictions. Populism was only the first sort of ideational blow against what we would sort of call, a preference for the open global economy. The other two were the pandemic and also the growth of great power competition. So COVID-19's effects on globalization seem pretty straightforward, right? What was COVID all about? Doing everything that was the opposite of globalization. Staying apart from each other, actually implementing travel bans, quarantining people if you thought they were sick, disruptions of supply chains. It was largely thought, oh my God, we used to think that we could rely on the global, supply chain to actually deal with all of our wants and desires, but if suddenly there are places under lockdown, well, this could be a serious problem. And so as a result, what there began to be a critique of was the very ideas that animated a lot of the productivity gains that occurred under globalization. Things like just-in-time manufacturing, where the idea was you don't hold inventory because you can, supercharge when you need it. And so therefore you don't waste that much in the way of inefficiency. And so as a result, you wound up feeling that instead of caring about efficiency, you wanted to care about resiliency. You wanted to make sure that you were part of a national economy that could deal with shocks, that could be resilient. And that's not necessarily, again, inherently a bad thing. But as the European, the European Commission Vice President said, we want to avoid being ever dependent on, let's say, China or India for pharmaceuticals and what have you. And then the third thing was the sort of rise of great power politics and the belief in weaponized interdependence. And here I can speak from experience. This is an idea that my colleagues Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman came up with. They published a very famous article in International Security, I believe only 4 years ago. But it was one of those rare academic papers that got read everywhere, including in Washington. Basically, their argument about weaponized interdependence is that rather than thinking of the global economy as just a bunch of atomized buyers and sellers, we should think of the global economy as a network. And there are people like Thomas Friedman who, when they talk about networks, assume, well, networks are flattening. Farrell and Newman argued, no. What networks do is concentrate power in central nodes. And so if you're a key node and you can actually manipulate access to that node, you have power. So if you can, let's say, control, access to the SWIFT network in terms of banking, or access to internet architecture, or access to 5G, this creates durable advantages for those who control those nodes. One is something called the panopticon effect, which is the idea that you can essentially surveil everything that's going on within your network. And the other is the choke point effect, which is a polite way of saying you can sanction people if you so choose, and you don't need anyone else's cooperation to do it. So there are plenty of examples of weaponized interdependence. There was a whole lot of hysteria about Huawei and whether or not it would be responsible for all the 5G architecture that was being created going forward. And then, of course, there's SWIFT, which is the international financial messaging network that banks rely on. And the US, for a variety of reasons, can basically tell SWIFT whatever it wants to do, which was actually a shock to Belgium because that's where SWIFT is headquartered. But because the US is so powerful in terms of capital markets, SWIFT will accede to, their wishes. The US has increasingly embraced weaponized interdependence as a common tactic of economic statecraft. Indeed, my colleague Chris Miller at Fletcher was interviewing Trump administration officials and actually had a Trump administration official literally say, weaponized interdependence, it's a beautiful thing. And so they began to apply techniques of weaponized interdependence against China in particular, banning certain companies, putting them on the Commerce Department's entity list, essentially finding ways to restrict China's ability to compete in areas like semiconductors. And the primary difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on this is that the Biden administration is doing what the Trump administration wishes it could have done. And that essentially the Biden administration is much more competent at applying weaponized interdependence than the Trump administration was. And so we've seen this in, for example, the executive order that came down in October, basically making uses of things called the foreign direct product rule to try to ban access by Chinese companies to any high-level, high-tech semiconductor equipment. And you're seeing increasing uses of that, not just in terms of semiconductors, but also biotech, AI, and quantum computing. And it should be noted that this is not, weaponized interdependence is hardly, it's not like the US is an outlier in terms of embracing weaponized interdependence. The reason the US stands out is because there are more central nodes located in the United States. But you are seeing other countries basically embrace the idea of either weaponizing interdependence or resisting it. You see this in terms of China's language, in terms of their economy about dual circulation, the idea that they need to rely much more on their domestic market than export markets. You see this in all of Russia's rhetoric about being a resistance economy, about being a sanctions-proof economy, and also in their attempt to weaponize the control of pipelines of energy and oil and natural gas going into Western Europe. And indeed, even smaller powers like the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has attempted to use this by somehow sanctioning the not the UAE, Qatar, for housing Al Jazeera and being too cozy with Iran. Now, what I want to stress about this, though, and this is important, is that these are ideas that cause people to resist the idea of an open global economy. These ideas are not necessarily true. In other words, people believe them, but I actually don't think they have a ton of empirical validity. So the China shock was real, for example, but there are suggestions that it was, the initial econometric studies on this were exaggerated somewhat. That in fact, as it turns out, the US economy as a whole did better as a result of China's entry into the WTO. And indeed, part of the reason, for example, the US has had a low inflation environment from 2000 to about 2 years ago was in fact China's entry into the WTO. In terms of the COVID shock, the idea of, we need to avoid complex supply chains. It turns out that most research on this shows that it's actually the most complex supply chains that prove to be the most resilient in response to COVID. Now, this seems extremely counterintuitive. The basic argument is that any country or any sort of global supply chain that's really complex, they're aware of the complexity and will therefore build in redundancies just in case. It's the more simple supply chains that were sort of caught unawares by what happened in terms of COVID. And in terms of weaponized interdependence is not always a thing. Part of the reason I edited a volume called The Uses and Abuses of Weaponized Interdependence was to point out that just because you think something is an economic network doesn't mean it actually is. And it doesn't mean that, applying the choke point effect will work. And the best example of this is Russia's attempt to force Europe to stop supporting Ukraine by cutting off flows of oil and natural gas. As it turned out, Russia had one bolt to shoot, it shot it, and now as a result, Europe is essentially going to be increasingly energy autonomous as years pass. Now finally, we have shifts in the distribution of interests. And it used to be the case that back in 2008, part of the reason why the global economy stayed open was that most multinationals that were involved in global supply chains had a vested interest in keeping markets open rather than lobbying for domestic protection. All right? So in 2008, you had firms that desperately wanted to keep those supply chains globalized, and you had consumers that wanted to keep prices low and that wanted to be able to continue to have access to those cheap goods. In 2023, you are seeing both firms and consumers reconsidering their values on this. So firms are starting to retrench. For the longest time, including through the pandemic, there were pushes by the US government on multinationals to divest from China, and firms like Apple would stoutly resist, in no small part because they had massive asset-specific investments there and didn't want to move away. But you're now starting to slowly see a shift. If it wasn't the pandemic, it was the pandemic plus rising trade wars, plus great power competition. And essentially all these combined are for the first time causing these multinationals to start to divest away from China. Doesn't mean they're relocating to the United States, by the way. Doesn't mean they're home shore. It means they're moving to Bangladesh or Vietnam or India or Mexico. But they are attempting to engage in what is called friendshoring. And again, these moves by Apple are not massive, but they're moving in the opposite direction from what they used to do. More interestingly, you're seeing a real shift in public attitudes, which is the US, if you take a look at the American public now, part of the reason that politicians are outbidding each other in terms of being hawkish on China is that the American public is already there. The American public views China increasingly in an unfavorable way and as an economic threat. And so as a result, they will probably, even if they on the whole, and if actually, if you take a look at overall public opinion polls, Americans are broadly supportive of globalization. But what they are doing is disconnecting globalization from trade with China. So they're perfectly happy on trade with Europe, trade with others, but China, they want to segment. But if the two largest economies in the world stop trading with each other, that's going to be a significant dent in terms of globalization. These trends are likely to continue. You've seen the Biden administration embrace sort of the largest, sort of ambitious plans in industrial policy in at least 30 years, which means there's a lot of subsidy money on tap from Washington. And if you're a firm and you're choosing between, let's say, access to the Chinese market or access to that money, you might choose that money instead. And that might shift corporate incentives over time. And also, increasingly, firms are going to now be concerned about brand integrity. Indeed, one of the most interesting things about the Russia sanctions wasn't the sanctions that were actually imposed. It was the number of Western multinational corporations that voluntarily pulled out of Russia. Not because they were offended by Ukraine. I mean, I'm sure they were offended by the invasion of Ukraine, but let's be honest, that wasn't the primary driver. The primary driver was how their consumers would react if they stayed in Russia. And what will be interesting to see is whether or not that winds up being extended to China as well. So given all this, are there any countervailing effects? All right, remember when I said before, in the 1890s, in the 1970s, yeah, you saw these, shifts in power and interest in ideas pushing towards closure, but you also had technology and finance and security pushing in an opposite direction. In terms of technology, most of the major technological innovations that we're considering and we think going forward are actually going to push more towards autonomy than integration. All right? Things like alternative sources of energy means you don't need to trade for oil. You don't need to trade for natural gas if you have solar or wind or electric batteries. Similarly, things like 3D printing also reduce the need for international sources. There are some areas where this is true, particularly for like rare metals in terms of electric batteries, but those are the exception and not the rule. Are there financial innovations that could cause the world to become more integrated? No, and again, I'm going to bash crypto here. All right. If it was a year ago and I would have said no, someone would have said, well, what about crypto? I watch those Super Bowl ads, come on. No one thinks that crypto is necessary. The only, as near as I can determine, like I resisted for a long time in my global political economy class teaching about crypto. But I kept getting Fletcher school students saying, come on, what about crypto? Crypto is going to be the next big thing. So I started researching crypto. And what I basically discovered is crypto has one useful purpose, which is to evade economic sanctions. If you want to engage in criminal activity, crypto is your thing. Beyond that, I don't think it has any useful purpose whatsoever. All right? And so it's not going to be a finance thing that increases economic exchange. And as for security, we are obviously in a less secure environment than we were 15 years ago. If anything, security is going to drive more, is going to basically be an implicit tax on increased amounts of economic exchange. The bitter irony of this is that for a long time, critics of globalization argued that whatever its benefits, it also increased economic inequality and stifled democracy. All right. In particular, Danny Roderick made this point in a variety of books about globalization. What is interesting is that even Roderick is now somewhat appalled about what people are doing. And that quote on the right is what Roderick wrote in a recent op-ed, in which if you think neoliberal globalization was bad, this is worse. Handing the keys to the national security establishment is a worse path. And the reason is that as much as Roderick might have been a critic of unfettered globalization, he is a fan of globalization. Another irony about this is that for all the criticisms about globalization increasing inequality, the most recent data suggests the opposite is the case. Oh, I get to use the laser pointer now. This is fun. Okay, so this blue line is a very famous graph called the elephant graph. Has anyone ever heard of this? Branko Milanovic basically looked at what happened in terms of global income between 1988 and 2008. And essentially, it's an elephant. That's the trunk, that's the hump. What happened between 1988 and 2008 is there were two major winners of globalization. The first were sort of lower income people living in China and India. The second group was the 1%, the sort of Davos elite. This group down here, working classes in the developed world. They were they still did somewhat better, but they were the relative losers. What is interesting is that this has been taken as an article of faith ever since Milanovic developed the chart in 2008. The yellow line, is what we've seen between 2008 and 2018. And it turns out now, globalization is great for the poor. In fact, the biggest winners have been the poorest members of global society. And in fact, if you take a look at sort of the data that disaggregates countries and just treats, all residents of the world as citizens, and then look at Gini coefficients, global economic inequality has actually declined over the last 20 years. And that's due in no small part to globalization. What I think you're seeing is a shift in what Roderick referred to as the governance trilemma. So the governance trilemma says you can have two of three things. You can have hyperglobalization and democratic policies, but you got to give up national sovereignty. You can have national sovereignty and hyperglobalization, but you have to give up democracy. Or you can have democracy and national sovereignty, but you got to give up hyperglobalization. During most of the post-Cold War period, the choice was to surrender national sovereignty. They were big fans of hyperglobalization, and of course democracy is still popular. And so as a result, you had a system where global governance began to matter more and more. There were more, sovereignty mattered less and less. What I would argue we are in a world, our current world is one in which what we are giving up is hyperglobalization. Instead, you have a world of national sovereignty and populist democracy. Now, Roderick in some ways wanted this world because he thought this would lead to the sort of Bretton Woods compromise, the embedded liberalism of the early Cold War era. What he didn't realize was that there was another possibility, which is populist nationalism. And that's the world we're actually moving towards. Now, maybe this won't be a bad thing. Great power competition, can lead to war, but it can also lead to occasionally productive forms of competition. Think about things like the race for developing the first vaccine during COVID-19, or things like the space race, where you actually have different companies, different countries trying to compete to be first. All right, sometimes competition actually does yield, even between countries, positive outcomes. My concern, and this is a project I'm going to start work on, beginning this summer, is that the stability of the global order depends, at least in part, on some of the great powers believing that the future is favorable to them. Because if you think that the future is going to be less favorable and that you have an expiring window of opportunity, you will act rashly. You will take risk-loving actions now to try to course correct. In some ways, you can argue this is why Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia didn't invade Ukraine because they perceived the United States as weak. Russia invaded Ukraine because they perceived Ukraine as drifting towards the West. And a fear that if they didn't act now, it would be even harder to keep Ukraine in their orbit in the future. So Russia has relatively pessimistic expectations about the future. The US has powerfully pessimistic expectations about the future. Just take a look at any poll in terms of asking about the direction of the country or whether people believe that their children will be better off than they will. Now, China has historically, over the last couple of years, over the last couple of decades, had a more optimistic view about the future. They think the future is favorable to them. And if your economy grows by 10% a year, yeah, you're going to be pretty optimistic. But those days are long gone. And China is now facing a world in which they were devastated by COVID, not in terms of loss of life, but in terms of loss of economic output. They're finding the rest of the world more hostile to them. And they're increasingly brittle in terms of their governance. And my concern is that China will also start believing that the future is less favorable to them. And so as a result, take riskier actions like, invade Taiwan. So that was all pretty, dire, and I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty pessimistic. But I do want to close on one optimistic note, which is human beings are awesome, okay? We invented duct tape. We invented Twinkies. These are unambiguously good things, and I will brook no opposition from anyone on this. We might be on the way towards inventing viable fusion power. All right. These are not insignificant innovations. In some ways, the secret of American power has always been to innovate our way out of problems. And as much as the United States excels in terms of foreign policy at shooting itself in the foot, no country is better at healing itself from shooting itself in the foot than the United States. And so I will close on that optimistic note. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
No, you already did. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, Professor. That was incredibly interesting, and I'm sure there are many questions that people have to ask. So we will now be transitioning to the Q&A portion of the evening. So please come and line up. We only have one mic today. At this mic to ask your question. Please keep it brief. For sure there are many students who do want to ask something, so only ask one question and make sure to introduce yourself. Say your name, your major, as well as your class. Thank you so much.
I thought you were going to say astrological sign.
No, I just forgot the third.
Hello, I'm Thomas. I'm a Pisces. My major is international political economy. I'm a first year. My question is regarding world orders. It's something that you touched on quite a bit.
Yep.
It's kind of a two-pronged question. So you talk about trends are moving in a very different direction, and we're arriving at a different world order. And that's kind of my question. Are we arriving at a different world order? Whereas right now we're in the world of Westphalia, which promotes sovereignty, but there's also this level of interconnectedness, which you touch on. If we're losing this interconnectedness, are we seeing a different order altogether or a hybrid of Westphalia? And the second part of that question is, if we're moving into a different world order, does that world order benefit who it's currently benefiting or a different entity altogether?
Okay, so the first answer is, yeah, I think we are going to be moving to a different world order. The question is how we move there. And this is a really awkward fact about international politics, which is by and large, different world orders in international politics usually happen after great power wars. You know, end of World War I, end of World War II. The end of the Cold War is almost a special case because it wasn't a violent end, but it was, a significant collapse of one of two poles. The real question going forward is, do you have another great power war? And if you don't, and there are reasons why you might not, there are reasons to be optimistic. But then we've never been in a situation where we sort of have an evolution of world order as opposed to a revolution in world order. And what I do wonder is, is there going to be an easy transition from one to the other? Or do we wind up with considerable shock after shock? Financial crisis, climate change, another pandemic, or so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I think, there are some folks, Adam Tooze talks about the poly crisis, for example. I'm not as crazy about that term, but that is one other possibility that we wind up transitioning to. In terms of whether there are winners or losers, I think the reason we're shifting to this new order is because, for lack of a better way of putting it, actually, let me go back. The key thing to look at is that yellow line, all right? The US and Europe and all the developed world, that's where we are. And so there's a perception that, ironically, we're the losers right now. And part of the reason you're seeing this shift is a belief of if we pursue more autarkic policies, maybe we'll become winners. I don't think that's accurate, but I see why they're advocating that. So it doesn't matter so much the answer is the most powerful actors are always going to try to preserve their winning percentage. It doesn't mean, however, that they're right.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Hi, my name's George. I'm a politics, philosophy, and economics major, sophomore at CMC. Thank you so much for your talk.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about polarity, and one of the things that you indicated as being so helpful in recovering from the 2008 financial crisis was U.S. hegemony,
Yep.
And that's clearly fading. I guess my question is is that heading into you mentioned sort of unequal bipolarity.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, I think, friendshoring. Should we be seeking? I think should we be fighting to preserve our hegemony, or should we be looking for ways to create a sustainable form of bipolarity or multipolarity?
I think what I would say is we should be looking for a sustainable form of bipolarity. It's not. By the way, by saying that, I'm not trying to say the U.S. is lost. That's it. You want to ask the awkward question of, do you want to keep 1 billion Chinese impoverished? I don't think that's an inherently good thing. But the way to think about it is that in some ways, there's a danger that a lot of Americans seem to assume, well, you know what, this outcome is unfavorable, and that's because of U.S. foreign policy. And if we had done this differently, it would have ended better. And the truth is that gives way too much agency to U.S. foreign policy. All right? There are fundamental reasons why China is an increasingly powerful actor that have nothing to do with the United States. And it doesn't matter what U.S. policy does going forward, China will still be a more powerful actor. So the question is, how do you live with a powerful China? And in some ways, the answer I would give here is a reminder for those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War. The Cold War was bad, but the Cold War had rules. All right? The Cold War actually did have areas of limited cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And in some ways, I wish we had, a sort of stability that the Cold War offered. And I think the problem is we're seeing the emergence of a Cold War between China and the United States, but no one is entirely sure what the boundaries of that conflict should look like. And what I want to see is guardrails put on that conflict, because I don't think it's helpful.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Solomon. We've already met, but I'm a senior at Pomona, studying science, technology, and society and international relations. And I wasn't actually expecting to hear as much as we have today about China, so that's been a really valuable thing for me.
What did you think I was going to talk about?
And globalization more generally, perhaps, but
Okay.
I thought that our focus today led me to the question of when there is such growth happening, and I'm going to stay for 10 months in Beijing starting in August, do you think that there's going to be a democratic swing, or do you think that this sort of pessimism is going to lead to increased control, increased authoritarianism, and a growth of a sort of new type of future surveillance apparatus and tensions with Taiwan and the US that entrenches the current political system in mainland China?
It's the latter. It's definitely the latter. And in some ways, this is one of the sources of, I think, pessimism, which is if you go back to the sort of 90s and 2000s, the fundamental bet that U.S. foreign policy placed on the Sino-American relationship was if we trade more with China, China will feel like it has investments in the liberal international order. And then there was a second part of this, and this was more hopeful, but the thought was is that if China becomes more rich, China will naturally evolve in a more democratic way, like Japan did, like South Korea did. Turns out China doesn't quite work that way, all right? As you said, it has become more autocratic, more oppressive, in the last 10 years. Now, I think in some ways that has caused Americans to believe none of this was worth it. And this is where I would push back, which is I do think the degree of economic interdependence between China and the United States has actually averted what would otherwise have become a conflict, a militarized one. And this is where I get worried about decoupling. Because while I understand some pushes towards decoupling in some sectors, if you basically tell China that they should have no stake in the liberal international order, then essentially what you're doing is incentivizing China to A, create their own order, and B, care less about what the West thinks, which means why not take Taiwan? One of the disturbing things about, the sort of behavior of Vladimir Putin and the behavior to some extent of Xi Jinping is their belief that their legacy is going to be defined not by whether they brought prosperity to their country, but by whether they brought land to their country. And in some ways, this is antithetical to the whole sort of concept of economic globalization of borders don't matter. Turns out borders still matter. And so, unfortunately, I am worried that it's the latter. Now, I'm going to offer one ray of hope on this, which is the thing about authoritarian states is that authoritarian states look absolutely rock solid until the moment they collapse. And, what's interesting is that, hold on. That photo right there is of China COVID, the China COVID protests in November. And that actually led to changes in policy, all right? That took the Chinese leadership by surprise. It was unprecedented in scope or scale. It was the largest scale U.S., Chinese protest since Tiananmen. And in the end, what Xi Jinping winds up doing is backing down and lifting, all the COVID restrictions. And that's interesting. But, I also think they did that as a pressure valve. And I think you can't pursue a foreign policy predicated on the hope that Russia's going to become a democracy next week or China's going to become a democracy next week. You prepare for those contingencies, but that's not a policy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Olivia. I'm a sophomore studying international relations and public policy. You started to answer this in your response to the last question, but I'm curious as to what extent do you think that economic relations discourage states from engaging in conventional warfare, and do you think that a decline in globalization might make a conflict in Taiwan, for example, more likely?
The quick answer is that I believe in the commercial piece. There's some academic debate about this, but generally I do think that increased levels of trade and exchange between countries reduces the incentive to go to war with each other. And the answer is, yeah, I think if you see less and less interdependence, I would entirely envision a war, in Taiwan. And it's worth noting, in some ways, the danger here is that it's this mix of both interdependence and decoupling, because part of the reason Taiwan matters so much is that's where the most advanced semiconductors in the world are manufactured. And that's not going to go and shift anywhere else. And so that makes Taiwan incredibly valuable to the West. It somewhat makes Taiwan valuable to China, although there's this myth that somehow they're going to invade and capture those factories. Trust me, that's not going to happen. But yes, I do worry that as a result of reduced interdependence, neither China nor the United States sees any problem with the idea of going to war against the other. And I want to avoid that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Sam. I'm a first year from CMC.
That's my son's name, so your question's going to be really good.
I'm studying IR and economics. My question is, given the increasing trend towards viewing international politics with relative gains considerations, what are the prospects for cooperation on climate change, particularly given both China and the US's obvious important positions in terms of reducing emissions, but also given the likely unequal impacts of climate change on the developing and developed worlds?
I'm not optimistic there. You know, this is an area where, and part of the answer here is that I do think there's this belief that, you know, John Kerry has articulated this, the idea that if the United States is too hawkish on China, China won't cooperate on things like climate change. China will do what China, you know, is in China's own interest. So it doesn't matter what the U.S. does on these other areas. If China feels it's in its interest to cooperate on climate change, that's what they'll do. They're not going to engage in that kind of tactical issue linkage. The truth is, though, is that while you want to see cooperation on this issue, in some ways the bigger question is, to what extent will both states invest domestically? In other words, cooperation doesn't matter as much as the extent to both countries actually going further green. The cooperation part matters in terms of dealing with countries like in the global south. And that's important, and I don't want to minimize that. But if you're concerned about sort of large-scale aggregate effects in terms of climate change, it's what China and the United States does domestically. And I suppose there's a story you can tell in which the sort of push towards decoupling might actually encourage more, you know, a sort of more powerful green movement, the argument of we need to have alternative sources of energy so we're less reliant on, I don't know, the Middle East, for example, or Russia. There's a way in which that could happen. And so I don't want to preclude that possibility. But the idea of global coordinated climate change, I mean, I think, you know, in some ways the Paris Climate Change Accords might be the best we're going to see on that front, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I hope I'm wrong.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a second year at CMC studying international relations and Russian Eastern European studies. And you touched a little bit on the impact of the war.
Sorry, can you lower the mic a little bit because I can barely hear you?
No, you're all good.
Okay.
You touched on a little bit about the impact of the war in Ukraine, but I was interested in your thoughts on Russia and China's economic relationship moving forward in light of European sanctions and just the impact sanctions will have.
That's a great question. Russia has, you know, since the time of Peter the Great, Russia periodically has spurned the West and decided, no, that's it. We're actually an Asiatic power. We're going to embrace dealing with China. And to put it gently, every time it does that, it eventually sees its hopes dashed. Now, maybe this time is different because there are ways in which, you know, Sino-Russian trade should actually work reasonably well. You know, China is a technological powerhouse. Russia is a reservoir of raw materials. There are ways in which that exchange should actually work really well. That said, there are two things that I think will probably get in the way. The first is, anytime China deals with a sanctioned state, it drives the hardest bargain imaginable. They're really good at that. And this is going to infuriate the Russians. The second thing, and there's no politically correct way of putting this, the Russians have always looked down on China. Russia has always viewed itself as the more advanced, more sophisticated brother to China. And now, if you're looking at the balance of power, China is far and away the more powerful and more sophisticated actor. And the question is, how long can Russia live with that? Or to what extent do they start resenting it? But that said, if we're in a world where, you know, they don't like each other that much, but they hate the United States more, well, then our foreign policy will have succeeded in driving the two of them closer together. And that could still happen. So there are reasons to be skeptical of a sort of durable Sino-Russian partnership. But again, never underestimate the ability of the United States to alienate other countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have to say, this is the most incredibly ordered line I have ever seen. I am legit impressed by this. I am not going to forget this. Sorry, I apologize. Go ahead. Okay, you are good is what I'm trying to say. Okay.
We've been trained.
Okay, very good.
Hi, my name is Anjali. I'm a second year studying IR and history. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the implications of this shift away from globalization on multilateral organizations and just the way that it'll impact the role or the importance of agencies like the UN, World Bank, and as countries become less optimistic, do you kind of predict they're going to be less willing to engage through these forums on issues of transnational importance?
So, you're all young. It's very depressing to me. But I am old enough to remember, watching these agencies during the Cold War. And, like the UN Security Council, it's not that it didn't exist. It's not that it didn't matter. It's just that essentially there was gridlock at the UN Security Council because with very rare circumstances, like let's say sanctioning South Africa or dealing with, famine, inevitably there was deadlock at the Security Council. And that's the world we're shifting to now. There were a lot of multilateral institutions that were globalized in the wake of the end of the Cold War. A lot of these are now going to be, driven by, gripped by deadlock. So the UN Security Council, not going to accomplish that much. There's a whole panoply of multilateral export control regimes designed to prevent the proliferation of biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, ballistic missile technology. They're all going to get sabotaged now because China and Russia and the United States are not going to see eye to eye on this. The G20, obviously going to be somewhat paralyzed by this. Now, does this mean every international institution is going to be paralyzed? No. All right. The World Bank and IMF probably still going to function reasonably well. The Bank of International Settlements, there'll be international institutions that still function somewhat. But compared to, let's say, 15 years ago, global governance is going to be much more paralyzed than it was. And unfortunately, that might create a sort of vicious feedback loop where these agencies are now viewed as ineffective, which means they get less respect, which means no one is going to think about going to them. So unfortunately, I'm pessimistic on that front.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us tonight. My name is Jay. I'm a senior studying math and economics, senior. And so tonight we've talked a lot about Europe, North America, East Asia with China. My question, though, is more on countries such as in South America and Africa. How do they play into, the increasing tensions with, North America, East Asia with China and the U.S., and maybe talk a little bit about, kind of the investment China has in Africa. I don't know how much of an impact that has, probably for the future, but if you can just talk about that, that'd
Sure.
be interesting.
That's a fair question. I mean, the reason I was talking a lot about these countries is in some ways they're the most powerful actors, and the sort of countries in Latin America and Africa, unfortunately, are system takers rather than system makers. Now, it is possible that what these countries will try to do is essentially avoid any sort of geopolitical competition between the United States and China and say, hey, why can't we just trade with everyone? And this is one of the interesting sort of twists going forward, which is the US and China are going to care very much about developing economic blocs. The rest of the world probably doesn't want to see this. And the interesting question is if they don't want this, will you still, see essentially lots of trade going on, rather than the US and China trading directly with each other, they move through conduits like South Korea or South Africa or what have you. That is one possibility. Another possibility is that both China and the United States wind up taking more coercive actions to say you are either in our bloc or you're not, which is kind of what happened during the Cold War. And there is one third thing, and here I want to get a little more pessimistic, which is if climate change continues to worsen, it is precisely the areas of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia that will be the worst affected by it. And what you are likely to then see is increasing waves of climate migration going to richer places. To the extent that we've seen this already happen, that is also going to lead to increased restrictions on migration into these countries. And in some ways, that could be a fundamental conflict going forward, not between states, on this question, but rather between rich states and people that want to be part of those rich states.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Hi. My name's Ian. I'm a junior at CMC. I study philosophy and data science.
Oh, cool.
Thank you. I was wondering, so I think you very successfully proved that there are going to be large changes for national and international level organizations. I was more so curious about what you think the next 10, 20, 30 years for the average American will look like. I know that's kind of a hard question, but I noticed you pointed 3 things out specifically: pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and then sort of like a general GDP per capita ratio, which is really significant and substantial for poor or smaller countries. But I was wondering, when you look towards the not so far future, how does life for the average American change?
I really want to make a joke about the White Lotus right now, but I can't think of anything good. So let me point out 2 things. The first is that it's worth remembering, and I hate if this sounds elitist, but it is worth pointing out the average American does not give a flying fig about the rest of the world. And the reason for this is because most Americans live their lives without having to worry about what is going on in the rest of the world. All right? They're working, they're taking care of their children. They don't have a vested interest in caring about what is going on elsewhere. So, to some extent, the way that ordinary Americans will deal with the sort of, shocks that I'm talking about is that they're going to find inflation going up. They're going to find, things cost more. In some ways, that's what, you've seen over the last couple of years. And, they're going to find things being a little more difficult to do than they used to be. And so it's not that society is going to collapse. I mean, if society was going to collapse, it should have happened last couple of years. And I do think there's a danger sometimes of seeing like the pandemic and the George Floyd protests and the January 6th violence and thinking we're just descending into anarchy, all right? Let me make the counter argument that really what happened is that we had a pandemic and people freaked out, okay? And we weren't used to what normal behavior looked like. But the more we actually interact with people, hopefully the more those sort of social norms return. And that might actually be a positive thing. In other words, it might be that we hit the nadir and we're now trending back on that. But that said, I do think the move towards greater decoupling, the move towards less globalization, means a more inefficient global economy, which means people are going to be comparatively less well off and have to pay more for stuff. And they're not going to know why that is. They're not going to blame it on an end of globalization, but that's probably going to be the driver.
Thank you very much.
Yep. By the way, again, social mores here, outstanding. I'm really, this line is blowing my mind. Sorry, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Maya, and I'm a freshman from Harvey Mudd. And I was wondering, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. And
thank you.
Also, I was just wondering if you could talk for a little bit about the impact of the spread of the internet in the future on globalization.
So in some ways you can argue that, that DHL connectedness index that I showed at the beginning showing that the world was becoming ever more integrated, a large part of that has been data flows. In other words, the internet, as it's gotten more and more, global, and also the development of smartphones, you are seeing ever wider amounts of data being transferred across borders. And I think, when we were talking about this at dinner at my table, I think there's a tendency to assume, well, that's just going in one direction. There's no way you could ever stop the internet. There are plenty of ways you can stop the internet. And increasingly, what I'm concerned is that you're going to see states taking active measures to segment their internet from the sort of traditional internet that we're all used to. Indeed, you already are seeing that. This is the Great Firewall in China. This is censorship in Russia. In places like Saudi Arabia, censorship is really well developed. My concern is that this is going to go, further, and you're essentially going to have national internets rather than anything sort of global. Because as it turns out, it is possible to engage in those kinds of restrictions. Now, there are ways to get around it. There are VPNs in China, for example, so I don't want to say it's foolproof. But if you can block most of the people most of the time from getting access to information that you find politically inconvenient, states are going to do that. And so I guess my answer is that I can see the internet being segmented. I think I'll close on that. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay, sure.
Please join me in thanking Professor Drezner for his amazing talk today and incredibly interesting remarks. Thank you so much for the Keck Center for organizing this event, and thank you all for coming here on this Monday night and joining us. We hope to see you all at the Athenaeum soon again. Thank you so much.